Good morning, everyone. And firstly, thank you for your patience. We had a few technical issues there, wholly at our end, so apologies for delaying you by 8 or 9 minutes, but we are ready to go. So welcome to our webinar this morning, which is presented by Bakker Elkhausen in partnership with Nicola Pease. And we're going to be touching on getting really into the subject around flexible working, hybrid working, and what is the future of working. So good morning, everyone. My name is Stephen Howe. Just a few housekeeping exercises before we start. Everybody's camera and microphone is switched off by default. You will see at the top of your screen a couple of speech bubbles with question mark in there. If you have any questions for either Nicola or myself, please pop your questions in there and then we will run through all of those questions at the end. So we've allowed plenty of time for questions, Q&A session at the end. So just pop your questions in there and we'll deal with those at the end of the presentation. So yeah, we're ready to go. So Nicola, I'm going to say next slide, please, if you can. So there we go. So I'll start off with an introduction. For those of you who don't know me, good morning, everyone again. My name's Stephen Howe. I am the UK and Ireland country sales manager for Bakker Elkhausen. Hopefully you all know who Bakker Elkhausen are. If you don't, we design and manufacture software and hardware solutions for all digital workers. So whether you're a mobile worker, a flexible worker, a hybrid worker, if you're in the office, if you're doing a bit of both, absolutely, we have got some solutions that are there for yourself. So yeah, I'll let Nicola introduce herself now.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, as it says, I'm Nicola Pease. I'm the founder of Ignite Coaching and Consulting, and I help organisations to make flexible working work for them and their people. But we'll get more into that, I'm sure, throughout the webinar. Absolutely.
Thanks, Nicola. So yeah, I'm just going to start off with 1 or 2 slides from a Bakker Elkhausen perspective, just to sort of frame the presentation. So I thought it was good to start with a couple of quotations, one of them from John van Hooft, who is our own CEO, and the other from Howard Lewis, who is a group lead at Microsoft UK. So just looking at what John talked about, we see a lot of definitions in the media, on LinkedIn, in all sorts of social media around hybrid working. So just a couple of definitions that I've picked out that I think would be really interesting. So John van Hooft, who I said is the Bakker Elkhausen CEO, his definition when talking about hybrid working is it's a form of location independent working where the location of work and the compositions of teams are chosen on a task by task basis. So it's interesting what John's thoughts on that were. Howard Lewis, who I touched on before from Microsoft, when talking about hybrid working, he was saying it's the ability for tasks to be carried out successfully either on site or remotely, enabling teams to work together. The approach is indispensable for business resilience and innovation of business, in which technology plays an essential role. So a couple of leaders in the field and a couple of definitions or their thoughts around hybrid working. Nicola, if I could just have the next slide, please. Thank you. And yeah, just this goes back to a poll that we did ourselves as Bakker Elkhausen back in October 2020, so about 7 or 8 months ago, and we were looking at what were people's desires around working going forward. And the really interesting thing is that 75% of people, over 77% of people wanted to work from home in some capacity to benefit or to carry on enjoying the benefits that they had seen from home working. 69% of organisations were looking to reduce office space, reduce their capital commitments and increase their flexibility. Obviously, flexibility is the really, really important word for us. So, this is a great survey. Although it was done 8 or 9 months ago, it's still absolutely relevant. Almost 2,500 people responded. So, yeah, some great insight into the sort of things that we'd found out when launching a survey ourselves around hybrid working, flexibility from both organisations and from their employees. Hybrid working models increase resilience in crisis, as we've all seen throughout the pandemic. A lot of people have had to start working from home at very short notice. It's something they haven't done before, and people are, enjoying it still. Yes, it's difficult when you're doing it maybe 4 or 5 days a week, but there's still an enjoyment from that ability to sort of have hybrid working, home working in place. So again, just a couple of slides and a couple of quotes just to frame it from a backer perspective. I'm now going to hand over to Nicola, who's going to talk you through flexible working, how you would look to implement flexible working in your organisation. Hopefully some great hints and tips for you there. And again, just a reminder, if you've got any questions, pop them in the Q&A section, which you can find at the top of your screen in the question mark bubble, and I will cover those at the very end. So Nicola, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. So yes, let's talk about the future of work. And I love this quote, that the way, I'm not sure who said it actually, because I feel like lots of people have now said this. So the way we work has changed forever. If this last year has taught us anything, it's that we can work in a different way, and we've experienced a social and a societal experiment on a scale like never before. But what's interesting now as we're sort of coming out the other side of the pandemic is what that really means in practice, and we're starting now to see. So there was what the implications are. So there was a recent survey, this was the most recent one I could find, which is talking about this great resignation concept. And what this survey found was that 33% of UK employees were saying, if my organisation isn't going to allow me to work more flexibly going forward, then I'm going to be looking elsewhere to get that flexibility. And so I think there are 3 things that we will see and that we can 3 changes we can expect to see post-COVID. In a post-COVID world, we will get there eventually. So the first one is that hybrid working will become the norm. I think the vast majority of organisations are now looking at how they can split their time between office working and home working. We'll get into this a little bit later. Hybrid working comes in many shapes and sizes. It is not as straightforward as just saying, oh, we're now all working some of the time from the office and some of the time from home. There's lots of considerations there. The second point is that work from home becomes work from anywhere. So obviously this last year, and a lot of the talk about hybrid working has been around, you're either working from home or you're working in an office. But that's because of the restrictions that we've had in terms of our ability to be able to go and work elsewhere. Whereas what we'll see in a post-COVID world is that we can work from, I'm in a co-working space today, we can work from cafes, we could work from other branches within our organisation, we might work in client offices, and work from home really will become work from anywhere. And then the final point that I expect to see, and that we can, the research is all showing that flexible working arrangements will be key in retaining their employees. So that idea of the great resignation, and that there is this kind of bow wave of potential upset and how we're going to demotivate and de-engage our, disengage is probably the word, disengage our employees if we're not providing a level of flexibility. But that interestingly, and this is one of my personal bugbears around how hybrid and flexibility is being badged right now, is it's not just about the where we work, it's also about the when we work and about the how we're working. And if we want to think really about the future being flexible, not just hybrid, then you need to be considering all of those 3 elements. So I thought it might just be interesting to say why is the 9 to 5 dead, and why we shouldn't revive it. Hopefully, I'm sure lots of you have experienced the positives of this last year in terms of the ways that we have been working. And I carried out a research project last year. It was during the first lockdown, so granted, things have changed and shifted slightly. It's been really interesting to see how things have moved over the course of the last kind of 12 to 15 months. But what that FlexWorks research did was it showed what having more flexibility and what working in a different way can actually do. So it improves performance both at team level and at company level. So 56% of those companies that took part in the research said they'd seen an actual improvement in productivity and in performance. And 41% said that it had an increase in overall company performance as a direct result of working more asynchronously, of working more flexibly. It supports employee well-being, so there's been a lot of conversation around work-life balance, and what I would caveat with this is, at the start of the pandemic, this was very much something, and there are elements that still we are very positive today. So that idea of being able to balance our work and our lives more, that idea of, as Stephen said, of kind of splitting up our days a little bit, of maybe taking some time to do physical exercise, of maybe taking some mental health breaks, and having that ability to flex how you work during the course of the day has had a huge impact on employee well-being. What we also saw as we shifted to this new way of working was that there was a massive increase in the number of employer-led wellbeing initiatives. So there was everything from yoga Wednesdays to no email Thursdays going on, and kind of employers consciously thinking about how they could support well-being when we weren't physically located. What I will say is the pandemic has gone on, and the risk or the downside of this particular area is what I'm seeing now is an increase really in things like remote working burnout, and an increase in that concern over blurring of lines between home and work. So that sort of always on culture is something that's becoming a bit more prevalent. I think from an ergonomic perspective, I also read some research from Vitality recently that was saying there's been a huge increase in people over the last year who, because of how we've been working and been set up at home, they're seeing a massive increase in people with, neck pain, back pain, shoulder pains, because we're not sitting appropriately, or we're not kind of taking the breaks that we need during the day, etc. So whilst initially the feedback was very positive on this, I think there are some important watch outs in terms of how we move going forward. Other things that came out of the research was that it actually improved collaboration. And this is something that I find really interesting now. A lot of the rhetoric around us needing to return back to the office is because that's the place for collaboration, and that's the place where we can get together. But actually, the vast majority said that two-way communication had actually improved as a way of flexible working, and that it had enabled them to use more technology as a means of collaborating. So using those shared documents, using things like Google Suite, using things like Microsoft Teams, had enabled more collaboration to happen in real time. It kind of goes without saying, or at least I feel it goes without saying, that it opens up the talent pool massively. So if you think about, if we think about it in up until this time last year, for the majority of us, you needed to be able to live close enough to an office to be able to commute there. Whereas now that locational issue is no longer a thing, which means that you could be, sat in Cornwall, but working for a company that's based in Scotland, for example. But as well as locational kind of diversity and kind of opening up and widening that talent pool, what it also found was that it also created opportunities for increased diversity. So there were people who had previously, due to disabilities or neurodiverse conditions, had not had access to workplaces. And working in a different and more flexible way massively opened up those doors for them. And finally, what came out of the research was that working in this way can actually create a culture of trust. So there's a lot of talk around you need to have trust in order for this to work. But because this was a mass experiment, it forced us to have that shift in mindset around, people can still be productive when they're working from home, that we moved away from measuring whether we could physically see someone in the office to what were they producing, what were the outputs of their work. And so this was the outcomes from the research, and it's consistently continued through the pandemic in terms of what the benefits are of working in a more flexible and hybrid way. So how do you strike the balance? So how do you figure out the way of making flexible working work? So where flexibility works is in this sweet spot, I call it, between what the organisation needs to be effective and what your employees want to be able to be engaged and happy and motivated to actually work for you. And the way I do this with many organisations, the way I would, I guess my advice would be to, first of all, listen to your employees And I think there is what I see is or have seen is a little bit of a reluctance to ask employees what they want. And I think that's because there's still this fear of it will open the floodgates. What if it opens the floodgates and suddenly we have everybody saying they want to work from home all of the time, everybody saying they don't want to come into an office anymore, or the opposite, everyone saying they do want to come in an office again. And then there's this sort of concern of, well, if we ask our employees, we have to deliver what they want. And whilst that, that clearly there's an element of that is true, actually it's about approaching this from a balanced perspective. So yes, you do want to be delivering what your employees want, but that needs to be balanced with, at the end of the day, we are a business. We have business needs that need to be taken into account. And so I would always encourage all of the clients that I work with and anyone that I talk to around flexibility to first of all just talk to your employees. What kind of flexibility are they looking for? And then you can look at what is the art of the possible there. From an organisational perspective, it's taken some time to think about the why. What is the goal of having more flexibility for your organisation? And they can be many and varied. They can be broader societal type goals of, we want to improve gender inequality. We think that we want to engage more women in the workforce. To actually, we've run out of office space, or we want to reduce the amount of office space that we have, and we need to think about how we're going to organise ourselves in a different way. There's a whole host of reasons why an organisation will be looking at flexibility. But it's important to identify what those are so that as you're thinking about what that flexibility might look like for your organisation, you're making sure that you're going to achieve those goals and achieve those aims. And there's quite often byproducts of how you might implement flexibility. So I think I've got an example in the next slide, but one of the companies I'm working with, it was about office space. But it's led into, that was the kind of initial driver, but it's driven into a whole host of other areas, and they've seen a whole host of other benefits, like their ability to attract talent from outside of their geographical location, for example. And the final point I would say is what's most important is thinking about the what, the activities, and doing some analysis on what activities need to be done where and when. And you might do this at organisational level, or you might do this at team level, but thinking about when do we need to be co-located? What activities need to be done synchronously or can be done asynchronously? What activities are best done in person versus what activities are best done remotely? And it might be that it's a combination of both. So to give you a real life example of that, team meetings is something that comes up quite often when we're talking about activity analysis. And there's a sense of, team meetings work very effectively in a remote working environment. So they've worked effectively this past year. It actually takes less time up when we're all together, and when it's about kind of just an update and a flow of information, doing it remotely works very effectively. But then there's the element of, but sometimes we want to come together physically as a team, and we need that social connection, and we want that sort of banter that might go on in a team meeting. You also want that sort of those ad hoc conversations that happen before and after a team meeting. And so what I'm finding a lot of companies are doing in this space is going, in general, our team meetings will be done remote, but once every month or once every 6 weeks or whatever works for that organisation, we'll physically get together and have a team meeting in person so that we can continue that social glue. And keep building how we connect with one another. So to give you some real life examples of, how are companies addressing this and what are they working on? So I've got 3 different examples for you to give you different kind of ends of the spectrum. So I'm working with a law firm currently, and their driver for this was to meet employee demand. So it's, as a result of the pandemic, essentially, people have realised they can work differently and they want to continue that going forward. To avoid losing people, the law firm wants to recognise and wants to implement more of a hybrid working approach, and they've created a hybrid working policy that allows people to work from home kind of 2 days a week. They don't envisage any changes to their office utilisation, and interestingly, they're not planning on many changes to their ways of working, because it's more about you can do the same type of work whether you're in the office or at home, and it's about having that location flexibility for them. I'm working at the construction firm. It's an entirely different kettle of fish. So their aim is about improving attraction of women into the construction industry. It's typically very male dominated, it's very inflexible. This particular client told me that pre-pandemic, they had, their idea of flexibility was, well, you could take your lunch between 1 and 2 instead of between 12 and 1. And so the pandemic has kind of totally blown their minds when it comes to thinking about how they might be able to do things going forward. And for them, it's become about kind of categorizing levels of flexibility that they could have and that certain roles could have within the organization. Because clearly those roles that are kind of office-based, so predominantly they're like their head office functions, have much more flexibility around whether they can attend site or not, whether they work from the office or work from anywhere. Whereas the site-based roles clearly need to be on site. But what was an important principle for them was, we want to give some level of flexibility to everyone. So what might that mean at site level? And it's looking at things like how much control can people have over their rota, over which days they're working, over start and finish times when they're on site. It's that kind of thing that we're looking at when it comes to site-based working versus the office workers, which are much more looking at a kind of more of a hybrid way. And finally, a tech startup company. So for them, it was about, we're growing massively, but we've realised as a result of this, we don't necessarily need to increase our office capacity as we grow. And for them, what it was is looking holistically at changing the ways that they work. So that they come together in sprints, essentially. So they come together in a sprint to do the planning that would be done in person. Generally kind of once a quarter they'll come together, and then after that it's people have the flexibility to work where, when and how they want to be the most effective in order to deliver the work that they've agreed they will do. And as a result, they're not moving to new offices, and they've instead introduced a desk booking system to kind of manage that office capacity. But some companies are going even further than that. Now, granted, these are bigger companies, so that could be why they have, and they're further along in their flexible journey. And you may well have come across some of these because they've been in the news relatively recently. So Unilever's U-Work policy is really interesting. So this is about setting a new contract of employment with people, where employees can craft their own working patterns to suit them. So whether that's a few days a week, whether that's a specific project time frame, and what they are doing as part of this policy is, or they're trying to address 3 different generational issues that they have come across. So this is addressing those kind of millennial, the young folk who want to work more flexibly, might have hobbies outside of work, might have side hustles that they're working on, and not wanting to work in a kind of traditional way anymore. It's those people who are parents and recognising that when people are parents, they need to kind of shift around working patterns for a period of time. And it's looking at those people who are headed towards retirement, but not quite ready to go from all to nothing. And what this policy does is it encompasses all different ways of working that people within those different personas might want. It's really interesting, I think. We'll have to see how that goes in a few years' time. I think they'll be measuring it. Atlassian have moved. So if you don't know Atlassian, they are a software company. I know them because I use Trello boards. That's what they had created. They've gone from a work from any country in the world you like, as long as we have a corporate entity there, and you have a legal right to work there. So the idea being that people can work literally from anywhere in the world. And what this is allowing them to do is to move out of that Silicon Valley bubble of where kind of tech talent is competed over in a ridiculous way, and people get paid extortionate amount of money in order to deliver what they are being asked to do. And what they're saying is then they'll ask people to come together probably 4 times a year in a sort of through conferences, learning, team events. But outside of those 4 times a year, if people want to travel the world, if people want to be based in different parts of the world or different parts of the country, then that is not a problem for them. And finally, Grant Thornton, so they are a professional services company. And they have they've got 2 sort of streams for their, what they call their agile talent policies. So one is kind of internally, all of their roles are offered as flexible by default. So every employee can say the way in which they want to work, whether that's hours or location. But they also have an agile talent network, which is about contract and consulting staff. So where people can come and work for Grant Thornton on a project by project basis. So again, kind of similar to the Unilever policy, where it's much more flexible around what, you know, people choose whether they're going to be working or not working and have contracts on that basis. So when we think about hybrid working, there is a huge scale of flexibility in there. Everything from your kind of office-centric, the office is the centre of our universe, the way we work doesn't change regardless of whether we're in the office or out of the office, to employee-driven, completely optional, completely variable. And depending on the scale of those levels of flexibility, there are then consequences, I guess, implications of it. So if you're taking a more kind of top-down fixed approach, it means that there's limited changes to your working practices. But the flip side or the positive of this is it provides real certainty. So what some organisations want right now, and certainly in terms of perhaps their first step in the hybrid journey or in a flexible working journey, is about providing certainty about, you know, where and when are we going to be working, how are we going to do this going forward. And it allows, you know, there's nothing wrong with this. This is a first stage because it allows organisations to kind of get on that first rung of the flexibility ladder and say, okay, so what does that mean? And then they can continue to build from there. If you go to the opposite end of the scale, where it's completely optional, it's completely variable, it will require holistic changes to working practices. So it could go as far as things like self-managing teams, people having individual performance metrics and reward, etc., based on what they deliver, rather than having it kind of company-wide. It gives individuals more choice about where and when they want to work, and it requires a big change in organisational cultures and behaviours if you're going from a traditional 9-to-5 way of working right to this end of the scale of flexibility. And then, of course, there's 100 variations in between those 2 scales. So what does this all mean? What does hybrid and flexible working mean for leaders? It does mean quite a lot of changes, actually, and some of the challenges that I'm helping organisations with right now is that it feels like leaders and managers there's a lot of pressure on them to get it right. They sort of become the pinch point of making decisions about what working patterns will work, about being that kind of middle person between negotiating what the employee wants and what the organisation wants. And so there are some fundamental changes for leaders, and how organisations can support those leaders is in equipping them to have those conversations, is in providing the toolkits and the guidelines and the fundamental principles and the rules, if you like, around what's okay and what's not okay, so that those leaders can go into those conversations feeling much more confident that they are able to have open and honest conversations with people. But in practice, when we get to hybrid and flexible working, what that means for leaders is there's a lot more careful planning and organisation of work that needs to happen. So if you think about it, you've got to think about, when do we need to come together? Why do we need to come together? And how will that be managed across the team and across the organisation? So not just thinking around my own team, but also thinking about the interactions that my team have and that I have with other teams across the organisation, so sort of that T-shape of leadership. It means redesigning work practices to be hybrid. And this includes things like everything from meetings to development opportunities. This again is a big thing that's coming up at the moment, which is around, if you think about those people who are in their early stages of their career, and probably for most of us on this call, we weren't working in a hybrid and remote working way when we did that. The way you learned was on the job, sort of through osmosis, wasn't it? Like that's how you learn how to develop and how to do the jobs that you're asked to do. So when we're looking at hybrid and flexible ways of working, how do you create development opportunities and learning opportunities that are both office-based and non-office-based? Because what you don't want to do, for example, is for the office to be the only place you can learn and develop. It's thinking about intentional co-located time. So I've probably covered that already, thinking about, when do we need to be together and how will we manage that? It's clear communications, what's okay, what's not okay, and following on from that probably is then agreeing the team rules. One of the things that I have found to be really effective in making flexible working work is at team level, having almost team charters or protocols around how will we work together? How will we let each other know whether we're going to be in the office or not? How are we going to structure our meetings? How far in advance are we going to plan our meetings so that we can account for, next week Wednesday is an in-person meeting and we're going to plan that ahead of time. And having those rules and those protocols, it's like setting out the new set of behaviours, and it also enables teams to call out each other if there's something that isn't working, so you can continually adjust and review and kind of iterate how you work together going forward. For managers, there's a big part of thinking about fairness and inclusion in this. So fairness of how rules are applied is something that comes up consistently, but also thinking about inclusion and potential biases that happen as a result of not all being physically in the office at the same time. So there's that sort of presenteeism bias of, oh, Fred's over there, so I'm going to go talk to him about this project that I'd like him to work on. Whereas Joe is at home and I haven't talked to Joe because she wasn't physically there in the office. So thinking about how we might overcome some of those biases and overcome some of those issues around inclusion. Measuring outputs, not hours, is something that's fundamental for leaders, and what we'll see and what I anticipate over the next 12 months is a bigger shift in this. I think over the last year we've been in crisis management mode, and so this has happened naturally. But I think what we'll start to see changing now is more formal ways of measuring output. So in things like performance management, in appraisals, etc. And finally, rethinking kind of duty of care and well-being to employees. So how might we ensure we're not encouraging people to be always on? How might we help people set their boundaries between home and work? How might we ensure that, so I loved this, one company I'm working with at the moment is going to set core hours of work. So they're saying that all internal meetings will be done between the hours of 10 and 3, so that they can guarantee that's when people will be online, that's when we'll hold the majority of our meetings. But what they want to do is have a seasonal variation to that. So when it comes to winter time, they want to break that up so that there's part of the day when there is daylight that people can get out of their house and actually kind of experience daylight in the dark winter months, which I think is a fantastic way of thinking about their employees and kind of taking that well-being to the next level. And finally, obviously, most importantly, it goes without saying, trust. That's what it means for leaders. You have to trust your employees that they're doing what they say they're going to do when they say they're going to do it. And that trust goes both ways as well. The employees need to trust that you are, as a leader, are not going to be monitoring and checking them every 2 minutes to see if they're at their desk and working. And what does that mean for workspaces? So lots of changes for workspaces I foresee. So changes around office utilisation. So a lot of the talk is around offices are spaces for connection, spaces for collaboration, not so much spaces for individual focused work. And so I think what we'll see is changes around how our office spaces are used, and demand from organisations to create more maybe informal meeting spaces, having formal meeting spaces, and probably, even though I've just said it's not for this, having those spaces for individual focused work. Because if you think about it, our days across the week are not generally made up of, oh, today is a collaboration day, tomorrow is a focus day. It is split out over the week, and what you will need to think about is providing those spaces for people. So that if they are trying to do a focused piece of work, they can, so that if they're in a kind of informal collaboration area, they can be, and if there's a formal meeting area, that they have that too. I think it means we'll see desk ratios change. No longer will it be a 1-to-1 ratio. It will be, I know, for example, at Jaguar Land Rover, they went to a 1-to-8 desk ratio when they implemented hybrid working. And I think we'll see more of that. With that might become some need for technology to support sort of office booking, desk booking, that kind of activity. So you can look at capacity in organisations. I think particularly over the next year, we're still going to be, whilst we might hopefully not be in restrictions, there are still going to be times potentially when we'll be monitoring, you know, how many people can we have in an office at any one point in time. I've talked already about the need for collaborative and private spaces, thinking about technology to support truly hybrid ways of working. One of my personal favourites is the hybrid meeting suggestions. I have a view on hybrid meetings, which I'm happy to share later, but for the purposes of this, I will say, when it comes to hybrid meetings, if you want them to work effectively, you need the technology that allows it to feel like everyone is physically in the room. Even if they are not, otherwise it's not particularly effective. And then finally, I think what we'll see is particularly city centre companies creating regional or local workspace options for people. So whether that's through existing co-working hubs, whether it's through existing branches that they might have. So for example, Nationwide are saying all of their employees can work from any one of their branches. To which obviously they have kind of across the country. So it could be within existing branches, or it could be that some organisations start thinking about where are their hubs and maybe creating office space themselves there. Finally, from me, I think, before we move back to Stephen and have a chance for question and answers, is obviously I would be remiss if I didn't say that this is what we do at Ignite. So we help people to create flexible working strategies that are going to work. We help you think through all of the things that you need to consider when you're moving into a more flexible and hybrid way of working. And we help to equip your managers with the tools that they need to be able to deliver it effectively and to be able to manage people in a flexible way. So are interested in flexible working, or if your organisation is considering moving into that new way of working and thinking, how are we going to do this? Then this is what we do, so please get in touch. And with that, I'll hand back over to Steve, I think, for our Q&A section.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that there are some questions in the comments box.
There are some questions. Nothing wrong with a shameless plug there, Nicola, at the end, by the way. So I'd have expected nothing less. I do that whenever I get invited on a webinar. I always get a nice little plug in where we can. So yeah, we have had some questions come in, and there's more coming in. So I've just made a note of 2 or 3 that I'm going to sort of throw out to you that may sort of take a couple of moments to answer. Someone made a comment around the subject of stealth pay rises they've heard about, where organisations are sort of looking to use this increased flexibility but to potentially avoid giving out pay rises because people have got lower travel costs, etc., etc. Is that something that you've sort of come across, or do you have any thoughts around that whole area around, does flexibility actually potentially impact someone's salary?
I would be lying if I said it doesn't have the potential to impact it. Yes, it does. What I'm not hearing and seeing is organisations particularly thinking about that today. Okay. But I do foresee that will be something that they are looking at in future. So thinking probably more about perhaps regional pay structures. So predominantly where there's been some sort of rumours and musings about it, but no real action yet, I would say. But predominantly where I'm seeing it, for example, is London-based companies who are seeing that their people are no longer coming into the office, no longer required to be in the office, and are therefore, perhaps relocating elsewhere in the country. And there's sort of a little niggling question in some people's minds around, should we be paying them a London-based salary if they're not actually in London?
Yeah.
So I foresee that in terms of reward strategies going forward, location will become one of the considerations. But what I'm not seeing right now is any companies actually taking that step and thinking about, yes, we're gonna not pay people's travel expenses because they're no longer, a travel allowance because they're not coming into the office, or we're going to adjust people's salary as a result. Right. But yeah, watch this space on that. Yeah. I think.
I was just about to say, watch this space on that one. I'm sure it'll, some sort of financial directors will be sharpening their pencil elsewhere, won't they, to have a look at that one.
I was going to say, watch Goldman Sachs space because it'll be them, but then they're telling everybody to get back in the office, so maybe not.
Absolutely. Yeah, a couple more coming as we've been talking there. So apart from buying at board level, these significant changes obviously need commitment across all management. How easy is it to get senior HR, FM, IT, health and safety, OC health, etc., managers to work in unison? So how easy is it to get all these different departments to pull together to make sure these changes happen effectively? And what experience have you got? Any advice around that sort of area of getting those teams to collaborate?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, actually, in my experience, and I'm sure there are organisations where it doesn't work quite as effectively, but in my experience, it's been very easy to get those groups of people together. Where it's been more difficult is where one of those groups has said, this is what we're going to do, and not included the rest. Because it then becomes like, this is a HR initiative, or this is a property initiative, or this is an IT initiative. And what that doesn't do is look at the whole picture around, there is a lot of things that actually really need to change when it comes to hybrid and flexible working to make it really work. So in the organisations I've worked with and in my own experience, it's worked best when you have got those people together. To get those people together, what you need is that direction from the business in the first place. So where it can sometimes fall down is if that working group is given the responsibility of designing what that new work needs to look like and making all of those kind of corporate level decisions, it can work depending on the organisation, but that's where some tension can arise then between them sort of thinking, well, I'm not sure that we're the people to be making these decisions, or then perhaps that's when the misalignment comes between what perhaps the exec board might want and what the working group might decide to do. Where I would say is more difficult is buy-in of managers across the organisation, because I think when you talk to and my background's HR, so perhaps I should probably throw that in there before I say it, but when you talk to your kind of enabling support functions of HR and IT and property, we kind of get it. We get what needs to happen to make this really work. We understand what needs to happen. But when you talk to managers across the business, that's where it can become more tricky, because it just feels hard, and it feels like this is a massive change, and it feels like as a manager, you're putting this onus on my shoulders, the responsibilities on my shoulders to get this right, and I'm not comfortable with that. And that's where you can get the tensions arising, and that's where I found it to be more difficult, is in engaging line managers.
Okay, interesting, great. Okay, thank you. Couple more questions have come in, so we've got a few more to go through. Okay, my council thinks everyone is a remote worker and will work in cafes outside using office space once a week. Are cafes a real option long term? Great question, because as I say, I think with those sort of type of locations being able to reopen, I guess people are looking to sort of use cafes a lot more, but I guess they come with their own issues, I guess, Nicola.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say my kind of instant reaction is it okay to work from an office 4 days a week? Probably not.
Yeah.
Is it okay to work from a cafe occasionally because it's nice to have a change of scenery from being at home and get out and be provided with coffee on tap? Yeah. I think it's quite an interesting take to say they're expecting people to work from sort of cafe spaces. There's a whole host of considerations that kind of, and flags that kind of come up in my mind there around.
I'm guessing GDPR, isn't it? I guess initially is people looking over your shoulder.
Yeah. And also things like, you know, ergonomics, having a, you know, sitting at a cafe on a laptop screen like this, you know, cafes are not set up to be appropriate workspaces, are they? Doing that on an occasional basis is fine. Doing that every day is not. Yeah, I could foresee more issues with that than benefits, if I'm honest.
Yeah. I mean, there's talk about a lot of, I mean, one of the ways to combat a lot of the issues with empty retail space, isn't there, of turning them into sort of co-working locations. So, you know, so employees have an option to go into maybe a sort of co-working location as opposed to sort of a cafe, etc. So it'd be interesting to see if the high street is really impacted, or we do see more of these co-working spaces appearing on the high street instead of the traditional retail stores. So that's potentially a way round, isn't it, for those, or for organisations, is using those sort of facilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in one today, so I can definitely highly recommend it. Yeah.
Okay, another question coming. Are organisations having to invest in new technology to facilitate the changes in workplaces? How do they make the most of sharing desk space up to 8 people as per the Jaguar Land Rover example? Do they have budgets allocated to this? So I guess there's 2 or 3 questions in there, but are companies putting money aside or really investing the money? Do they have it already there, Nicola, but then maybe need to use it more effectively? What was the whole piece, I guess, pulling back on your JLR example about 1 to 1 to 1 to 8? How does that work in practice, and what's needed to invest in that?
Yeah, so that was a whole-scale investment, because that's a great example of where we worked collaboratively with IT and with property and facilities and health and safety, etc., etc. So there was a big investment. Now I'll take this was back in 2014, 2015, so it was pre-Teams, pre-Zoom, all of that sort of stuff. So there was a requirement to invest in new technologies in order to make it work, just as there was also a requirement to invest in property and facilities and how we were using our office spaces. So yes, there was a large budget allocated there. However, that was kind of offset, if you like, between the alternative was to invest millions in new office space. And so the driver for JLR at that point in time was they were expanding rapidly. And it was do we invest in new office space, or do we invest in a new way of working? And for them, it was about a new way of working. Yeah. What I'm finding today is there's a lot of the technology exists out there, but there's a bit of a need to invest in training people to get the most out of that technology. And there is a smaller investment in terms of thinking about things like office booking space. Systems didn't really exist, or not many people use them sort of pre-COVID. So that there is a need for investment, but I would say it feels smaller these days because technology has just evolved and moved on.
Yeah. Absolutely. As we keep asking one question, another one appears, which is great, because again, it's the conversation's going off in lots of different tangents. So a bit of a statement, then a question. So the impact on health and safety and DSE when working from home, it'd be a manager's responsibility to visit the colleague's home, which could then lead to a manager spending time travelling to and from employees' home chosen workspace to carry these out. Can this be negated? So I guess the question ultimately is saying, Nicola, is if a manager no longer has 10 or 12 staff sat in front of them, but they're all dispersed, how does that tie in? And I guess pulling on your HR experience, how does that impact on a manager having to go out to visit people in person? What's the implications that can come from managing a team who are now working remotely?
So what I would say in my experience is that managers don't generally visit homes, and it's not in probably, I'm trying to think if I've come across any, probably 95% plus of situations I've found. that is not something that you would expect the managers to do, and neither is it something that the employees would like their manager just rocking up at their house.
So would the expectation be then that anything where a manager's maybe doing a review or something like that, that would be a piece of work that would form the sort of thing that would take place in the office as part of a flexible working policy, and not an expectation of them going to visit someone at home?
Yeah, absolutely. So you would expect that happens in a co-located space, which is not somebody's private home space. Now, it could be, if you're friends with your manager and you're happy for them to come to your house, that could be arranged. Yeah. But in general, it would either be something that's done in an office or something that's done that could be something that's done in a cafe. If you both happen to live in the same town, you might as well meet in the cafe rather than travel 30 miles to the office. But it's not, what I'm not seeing generally is that would involve managers visiting people's homes.
No.
On the DSE point, just quickly, what I've seen there predominantly come out over the last year is the ability to do that remotely and to do those DSE assessments remotely. Previously, prior to being able to do these things remotely, actually a lot of companies put that responsibility on employees rather than carry out their own assessments, rather than managers carrying out those assessments. Again, as a way of negating that need to go to houses.
Yeah, absolutely. Our hour is up. However, there's one last question I'd just like to touch on, and this basically someone asking. You gave some great examples before, Nicola, which I always think is a fantastic way of framing a conversation. But which sectors do you think have got the most work to do to really achieve the flexible working? Is there any particular sector that you've had experience and just thought they are going to have to really make some big changes, where other ones maybe are a little bit naturally further along the line?
So my immediate thought was kind of frontline, non-office based organisations are difficult. Because naturally their ability to flex things around is more difficult. So if you think about the NHS and the kind of shift workers and that kind of thing, it is quite difficult to do flexibility. It's not impossible. I will always say it's not impossible, but it is more difficult.
Yeah.
However, there's been a lot of work and a lot of research done in those sectors recently. Interestingly, one that I'm coming across at the moment, there's quite a few clients I'm working with who are in the legal sector. Okay. And it's fascinating because from the outside looking in, you think, they're all working in an office, they're able to work remotely, they have the technology to support what they need to do. But as a business model, it is all around billable hours. The amount of hours you do results in how much pay you get, how much pay the organization gets. And so shifting that mindset into thinking about outputs, not hours, is huge.
Yes.
So yeah, that's it's fascinating to be working with a couple of law firms at the minute to try and just unpick some of that and how might it work.
Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, well, that wasn't the answer I thought you'd come up with, I have to say. So it's interesting to hear. So we've reached our hour or just over, and we've used all the questions up. Firstly, thank you, Nicola, for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation. Really enjoyed it. I was going to say, anyone out there who's joined, if you want to obviously ask any questions of Nicola that you may think of this afternoon or in the next few days, obviously you can contact Nicola and Ignite via LinkedIn, I guess, is probably the best way to do it. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a great session. Again, apologies for the issues at the start with technology. So sorry that we're a little bit late. What we will be doing is sharing with everyone a link to a recording of this webinar. So if you want to watch this back, if you want to share it with some colleagues, some customers who you think might be really interested in the content, we'll get you that link sent out in the next 24 to 48 hours. Again, we'll probably publish it ourselves on mine and Bacca's LinkedIn profiles. Nicola again might look to share it ourselves, but again, thank you for joining. Thank you, Nicola, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon on the next Bacca Elkhausen webinar. Thank you very much and have a great day. Cheers. Bye bye.